The Serbian government is denying claims that security forces used a military-grade sonic device to disperse and scare anti-government protesters. Up to 325,000 people gathered in the capital Belgrade at the weekend to protest the deadly roof collapse at a train station last November. For more on this, I'm joined by Balkan Affairs expert from King's College London, Dr Andi Hoxhaj. Andy, good to have you with us on the program. First, I wanted to get to these accusations that Serbian authorities used a military-grade sonic device to disperse at least a section of that massive crowd we saw. Do we know if this was the case, and has this ever happened before?
Well, our first sort of report and what we are hearing in particular from the protesters that this has taken place, and they are planning to put in a lawsuit against the Serbian government at the European Court on Human Rights as well as the local courts. But the security forces in Serbia are known to use these sort of tactics, and in preparation for this protest, they have worked with a number of groups to kind of set up different camps around government buildings and kind of pretending as to be sort of protesters. And also, since the beginning of these protests started in November, the security forces have been using spyware system to hack on those protesters' devices, as well as to spy on them in terms of finding out how they are coordinating. And to make things even worse, these spyware were donated by international community to fight organized crime in the country, but in country they use it to sort of suppress these protesters.
Yeah, so what does this tell us about the rule of the president when it comes to, I suppose, freedom to demonstrate in a country like Serbia that's supposed to be a democracy?
Exactly, and that is what really the protest is about. It is about the rule of law, because what happens was there was a collapse of a train station roof in November in Novi Sad, where it killed 14 people and it injured a number of people. And the protest pretty much started about having a rule of law and having transparency over those contracts. And that kind of very much has resonated across the country in terms of how the current government, and particularly its president, is suppressing the rule of law. And what he has done, in particular since becoming president, he has expanded more and more his constitutional power to oversee the judiciary. And that is really much at the root of this problem, where there is not a sort of proper check and balances. And that's what the protesters are talking about. And it has very much resonated across the country.
And can you remind us again, why these protesters are blaming the government for the collapse of the roof on the train station Novi Sad last November?
So these sort of funding that were used to renovate this train station were actually funds in part from a Chinese government funding, and they were pretty much non-transparent. And after the roof collapsed, a number of protesters, as well as those that work on transparency and government efficiency, they found out that these were actually done in corruptive way. And the government has sponsored similar sort of schemes, and it has sort of found out that they were misused and mismanaged the funding and how they sort of renovated. And the government, as well as the protesters, are calling for full transparency in terms of how these reconstruction were done to find faults. And the Serbian government has refused to make them transparent. And then the protesters sort of pretty much started across the country, where they were asking for full transparency. And now they've escalated, where they're asking for the resignation of the president.
Yes, and has this entire sort of episode become more political now, with accusations from President Vučić that opposition parties are effectively trying to force his government out of power?
Well, he has used this sort of tactics before, because there have been previous protests in Serbia, and one of his go-to has been that these protests are actually funded by Western democracies and powers, and the overall goal is to overthrow him from government. And he has made the statement that he will not be overthrown, and neither he will flee to Russia like Assad and the others have done. But it's quite clear that the way how the system has evolved since he came to power 13 years has very much eroded the possibility for the opposition to come. Hence why the protests are neither trusting fully the opposition.
Yes, and what do you read into the fact that the Prime Minister Miloš Vuković wants to resign, but that's being held back by the president himself? Is that some sort of an admission of guilt on the government's part over the train station?
Well, we have to sort of put it into context. The government doesn't really have a full power. So Serbia is very much ruled by Vučić. So it doesn't really make a difference whether the prime minister resigned or the mayor of Novi Sad that resigned previously. But of course, they resigned in part to kind of take some blames and to sort of lower down the tensions. But nevertheless, the protesters would very much prefer to have a transitional government where Vučić is not anymore in charge and can prepare the country for a new elections that will not see Vučić as part of the government.
Yes, and do you think President Vučić may change his tact given the, how big the protests were at the weekend? We're talking about at least 100,000, but up to 300,000 people, and also to hold those responsible to account?
Well, he's under enormous pressure, and he has never been under such pressure as it happened over the weekend. And in part, he has been caught off guard, because in the part when protests have taken place, he has been very sort of clear who to target. But the clever thing about these protests right now, they don't have a leader, and they are pretty much run by students. And he doesn't really know how to deal or manage them. However, he has to sort of recognize, and in part, the discussion behind the scene, at least for what we are hearing from Serbia, are that he is afraid of what's going on, and he fears that this might sort of be the end of his rule in Serbia. But essentially, without him kind of agreeing to some sort of transitional government, it will be really difficult to lower down the tensions.
Okay, Dr. Andi Hoxhaj, thank you so much for giving us your analysis today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.